Haman built a gallows 23 meters tall, specifically to hang one man. He was so eager to see this man destroyed that he had it built overnight before he even had the king's permission. And by the end of the next day, Haman himself was hanging on it. That's not karma. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern that runs from Genesis to Revelation, a pattern so consistent, so almost embarrassing in how obvious it is, that once you see it, you'll never read the Bible the same way again. Your enemy has been working overtime against you, and they have absolutely no idea they're one of the primary instruments God is using to build your life. Today, we're going to look at 3 people in the Bible whose enemies did more to promote them than any friend ever could. And then we're going to talk about what that means for whatever you're facing right now. Before we get into the stories, I need to establish something. When the Bible talks about enemies, it doesn't just mean people who dislike you. It means people who are actively working against your destiny, people who have made a decision, sometimes consciously, sometimes not, to oppose what God is building in your life. And here's the thing about that kind of opposition. It doesn't look like it's helping you. It looks like the worst possible thing. It looks like betrayal, false accusation, humiliation, threat, injustice, everything you would logically call a setback. But in the hands of a sovereign God, a setback is often just a setup wearing a disguise. The enemy plants what they think is a mine. God looks at it and says, actually, that's a stepping stone. They meant it for harm. God meant it for something entirely different. Repeat that phrase. They meant it for harm. God meant it for something entirely different. That line isn't something I came up with. It's something a man said to the very brothers who had sold him into slavery. And it's where we're going to start. Joseph was 17 years old when his brothers threw him in a pit and sold him to a caravan of traders for 20 pieces of silver. 20. His brothers put a price on his life that would be embarrassingly low, even by ancient Near Eastern standards. These weren't strangers. These were his own blood, his own family, the people who were supposed to be on his side. And for those of us who have been betrayed by people close to us, I want you to sit with that for a second, because the Bible doesn't sanitize it. Joseph's brothers didn't just dislike him, they were consumed by envy, so consumed that they initially planned to murder him. Selling him into slavery was the merciful option. They took his coat of many colors, dipped it in goat's blood, showed it to their father, and let the old man believe his favorite son had been killed by a wild animal. Joseph is now a slave in a foreign country, speaking a foreign language, separated from everyone he knows, with no clear explanation for why God gave him those dreams if this was how they were going to end. Let me tell you what the brothers thought they were doing. They were removing Joseph from the equation, taking him out, ensuring he would never rise above them. Problem solved. Here is what they were actually doing. They were delivering him directly to Egypt. Canaan, where they lived, was a backwater, a region of sheep and tents. The people of Canaan would never have been in a position to save civilization from a 7-year famine. But Egypt was the superpower of the ancient world, the center of commerce, government, and grain storage for the entire region. Joseph could not have gotten to Egypt under normal circumstances. A shepherd boy from Canaan doesn't just walk into Pharaoh's court. There was no path, no visa, no connection, but his brothers put him on a caravan headed straight there. In their rage and jealousy, they did the one thing that got Joseph from the middle of nowhere to the most strategically important country on earth. So he ends up in the household of Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard. Immediately, God's favor is on Joseph. He rises to run the entire household. Things are looking up. Then Potiphar's wife falsely accuses him of assault. Potiphar has him thrown in prison. Now the enemy count is climbing. Brothers, now Potiphar's wife, now the system. And here's the irony you cannot miss. The prison Potiphar throws him into is the king's prison, the prison attached to Pharaoh's court. Joseph's unjust imprisonment, engineered by his enemies, is what puts him in the same facility as Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker when they have their dreams, which is what puts him in front of Pharaoh 2 years later when Pharaoh needs someone to interpret his dream about 7 fat cows and 7 thin ones, which is what leads to his promotion from prisoner to prime minister of Egypt in a single day. Joseph was 17 when his brothers sold him. He was 30 when Pharaoh promoted him. 13 years. 13 years in which every enemy attacked the pit, the sale, the false accusation. The prison was God's sovereign routing system, moving Joseph from step to step, corridor to corridor, until he was standing in exactly the right room at exactly the right moment. And then his brothers show up, starving, bowing, exactly like the dream said they would. Joseph looks at the men who sold him and says something that should be impossible for a human being to say. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Not you intended to harm me, and God worked around it. Not despite what you did, but God intended it. The harm was inside the plan. The betrayal was part of the routing. The enemies were on the payroll without knowing it." That's Joseph. Now let's talk about what happens when an enemy builds something for your destruction and ends up building your platform instead. Haman was the prime minister of Persia, second only to King Ahasuerus. He had everything: wealth, rank, power, access. And he wanted one more thing. He wanted a Jewish man named Mordecai to bow to him. Mordecai wouldn't do it. That's it. That's the entire source of the conflict. One man, one refusal to bow. And Haman couldn't let it go. His wife and advisers had a suggestion. Build a gallows. Not any gallows. Haman had this thing built 23 meters high. The height is almost comedic. This wasn't just about execution. This was about spectacle. He wanted everyone to see it. He wanted Mordecai's humiliation to be visible from across the city. He went to bed that night planning to ask the king's permission to hang Mordecai the next morning. He was that sure of himself. That same night, the king couldn't sleep. Read that again. The king couldn't sleep. In a story where God's name is never mentioned, the book of Esther is the only book in the Bible that never explicitly names God. The divine hand is everywhere, pulling strings no one can see. Ahasuerus couldn't sleep. He asked a servant to read him from the Royal Chronicles, a book of historical records, an ancient equivalent of reading a government report to put yourself to sleep. Of all the pages in all the Chronicles, the servant reads the passage about a time when Mordecai had uncovered and reported an assassination plot against the king, saving his life. The king asks, "What honor was given to Mordecai for this?" "Nothing," the servant says. "He received nothing." So when Haman arrives in the morning, eager to ask for permission to hang Mordecai, the king asks him first. What should be done for a man whom the king wishes to honor? Haman, assuming the king is talking about him, describes the most lavish public honor he can imagine. Royal robes, the king's own horse, a proclamation through the streets of the city. This is what is done for the man the king wishes to honor. The king says, "Great, go do exactly that for Mordecai the Jew." Haman, who came to the palace to sign Mordecai's death warrant, ends up personally leading Mordecai on horseback through the city, announcing his honor to the crowds. He went home and told his wife what happened. And his wife, who had suggested the gallows idea in the first place, said something striking. "If Mordecai is of Jewish origin, you will surely fail. You cannot win against him." By the end of the week, Haman's plot against the Jews was exposed by Queen Esther. Haman was executed. On the gallows he had built for Mordecai, let me walk you through what Haman actually did. He built a platform, literally. He constructed a structure that became the instrument of his own fall and the stage for Mordecai's honor. He initiated a chain of events: his obsession with Mordecai, his nighttime scheming, his early morning visit to the palace that triggered the king's question, which triggered the public honor which was the beginning of Mordecai's total reversal of fortune. Haman showed up to destroy Mordecai, and instead planned, funded, and executed Mordecai's promotion ceremony. He never saw it coming, not for a single moment. That is the pattern. 2 down. Now the third, and this one is different, because the enemy in this story isn't a villain. He's a king. And his attacks are what shaped the most important leader in Israel's history. When David killed Goliath, he was a teenager with a sling and 5 stones. He became nationally famous overnight. The women of Israel sang, "Saul has killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s." And right there, the relationship between David and Saul turned. Saul had been the hero. Now there was a new one. And Saul could not handle it. From that point forward, Saul became David's primary enemy. He tried to pin David to a wall with a spear twice. He sent him on military missions designed to get him killed. He offered his daughter as a wife with a bride price specifically intended to be a death trap, 100 Philistine foreskins. The expectation was that David would die in battle trying to collect them. David came back with 200. Saul sent assassins to David's house. He hunted him across the wilderness for years. David lived in caves, in foreign territory, constantly on the move, constantly in danger. Now here's the question. What did all of this do to David? Every time Saul sent David on a military mission to get him killed, David won. His military record grew. His reputation among the people grew. His experience as a commander grew. He learned to lead men in impossible situations, to trust God in life or death moments, to navigate betrayal without becoming bitter, to survive the wilderness without losing his calling. Saul was trying to eliminate David. What he was actually doing was training him. The man who would become the greatest king in Israel's history needed to know how to survive hostile territory, how to command loyalty from men who had every reason to give up, how to hold himself together when everything was falling apart. David could not have learned any of that in the palace. He learned it in the wilderness Saul drove him into. And there's a moment that captures everything. David is hiding in a cave. Saul walks in, alone, not realizing David is there. David has the perfect opportunity to kill him. His own men are telling him to do it. God has delivered your enemy into your hand. David cuts off the edge of Saul's robe instead, then feels guilty even about that. He steps out of the shadows and calls to Saul, shows him the piece of cloth, says, "I could have killed you. I didn't. May God judge between us. I will not raise my hand against the Lord's anointed." That decision made in a cave, unseen by the public, when no one would have blamed him for choosing otherwise, was the decision that defined what kind of king David would become. The wilderness Saul forced him into was where David's character was built. The enemy who was trying to destroy him was the forge. 3 stories. 3 sets of enemies. 3 completely different situations. Joseph's brothers intended slavery. It became a transportation system to the most powerful nation on earth. Haman intended a gallows. He ended up building a platform and hosting a parade. Saul intended elimination. He ended up running a military academy for the man who would replace him. The pattern is not that God rewards good people by defeating their enemies. The pattern is more specific and more strange than that. God uses the enemy. He takes their actions, their real, harmful, painful, unjust actions, and routes them toward an outcome the enemy cannot see and cannot prevent. They pour in effort and malice. God redirects the output. The brothers meant it for harm. God meant it for good. Haman built the gallows.